Toxteth Dock, Liverpool, 10 minutes past 2 in the morning, September 1955. Sub-Officer Frank Whelan, 43, Liverpool City Fire Brigade, 11 years at the Hatton Garden dock station. A documented composite officer built from Liverpool's dock station operational history, not a claimed individual, was reading the transit shed from the appliance before he gave the order to dismount. The smoke coming from the loading doors was thick, grey-white, and slow-moving. Not black, not fast. That told him two things before he had crossed the dock road. The seat was not oil or spirit, and it had been burning, low and contained, for longer than the call suggested. 11 years of transit shed attendances at Toxteth, Wapping, and Coburg had taught him what grey-white, slow-moving smoke from a mixed cargo shed usually meant. A cargo manifest told him what was inside the shed. The smoke told him what the cargo was doing. In September 1955, those two things did not agree, and Whelan had learned, in 1951, what happened when a fire officer trusted the manifest over the smoke. What did the colour and speed of the smoke from the Toxteth transit shed doors tell Sub-Officer Whelan about what was burning inside? And what had 1951 cost him that 11 years at the dock station had never let him forget? The Dennis F-12 that answered the Toxteth call was one of the pump escape appliances Liverpool City Fire Brigade ran from the Hatton Garden dock station, the brigade's dedicated C1 division, housed since the 19th century in the building on Hatton Garden itself, and the station from which the brigade's fire float provision on the Mersey had also been coordinated since before the First World War. By the 1950s, the Dennis F-series pump, descended from the Tamini-derived Dennis turbine pump, was built in the fire service trade to deliver as much as 1,000 gallons a minute in its larger configurations. More than enough, in a straightforward warehouse fire, to hold a seat while a second jet worked the exposure. What the pump could not do was tell Whelan what to point it at. A jet aimed at the wrong part of a mixed cargo shed did nothing but waste pressure. The alarm itself had come the way most Liverpool dock alarms came in this period. Not from an automatic detector, because dock sheds did not have them, but from a Mersey Docks and Harbour Board watchman on his round, telephoning the call through to the brigade control room. The watchman had smelled the shed before he had seen it. By the time the Dennis reached Toxteth Dock, the fire had already had however long the watchman's round had taken to notice it, and however long the telephone call had taken to reach Hatton Garden. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected a port city where a shed fire could cost hundreds of families their week's wages. What 11 years at the Hatton Garden dock station gave Sub-Officer Whelan was the difference between a bale that looked out and a bale that was out, and that knowledge left the brigade when the transit sheds it was built on were rebuilt around cargo that could no longer burn that way. And if you or your family worked the Liverpool docks, as firemen at Hatton Garden, as dockers, or as Harbour Board watchmen, put it in the comments. What do you remember about how a shed fire was fought, or what it cost the families depending on that shed staying open? The next video follows the Bristol Docks paint store fires of the 1930s, and what a burning paint store taught Bristol's firefighters about accelerant risk that no cotton warehouse ever could. Back at the appliance, what could the Dennis F-12's 1,000 gallons a minute deliver against a mixed cargo shed fire, and what did the pump alone have no way of telling Sub-Officer Whelan? What Whelan had learned by 1955 was not general knowledge about fire, it was specific knowledge about cotton. Compressed cotton bales, stacked in a transit shed floor to roof, did not behave like ordinary combustible stock. A jet could be played directly onto a smouldering bale for as long as the pump held pressure, and the fire underneath the surface would not go out, because water could not travel through a densely packed bale to reach the seat of combustion inside it. A bale could be soaked through, appear dead, and be logged as extinguished. Days later, when the bale was opened up for handling or moved into fresh air, the same fire would reignite from the inside, because oxygen had reached fuel that had never actually stopped smoldering. This was the specific danger Whelan had misjudged in 1951 at a comparable Wapping Dock cotton shed fire that Liverpool Fire Brigade's own records for the period would have logged as a standard bale fire attendance. He had signed the incident off as extinguished on the strength of a soaked, cooled stack. It reignited 2 days later once dock labourers began breaking the stack down for onward transport. Nobody had been hurt, but the shed had been closed for a second time, the second closure costing the same dockers a second stretch of lost wages, and Whelan had learned that a cotton bale fire was never actually finished at the moment it stopped producing visible smoke. It was finished when the bale had been physically pulled apart, hook by hook, and every smouldering pocket inside it exposed and wetted directly. What did the 1951 Wapping Dock reignition teach Sub-Officer Whelan about the difference between a bale fire that looked extinguished and one that actually was? And what did that lesson cost the dockers whose wages depended on the shed reopening the first time? Cotton was at least a known problem. What made mid-century Liverpool dock sheds genuinely unpredictable was what shared floor space with the cotton. Chemical shipments from manufacturing and agricultural suppliers, packed in drums and sacks that a dock shed clerk logged by weight and consignee, not always by chemical content. A drum fire behaved nothing like a bale fire. Some chemical fires spread across a floor faster than a crew could reposition a jet. Others reacted violently to the water a crew's training told them to use on everything else. The manifest, when the brigade could get sight of it at all, told Whelan what had been declared. It did not reliably tell him what a drum would do once it was burning, because dockside chemical documentation in this period was inconsistent at best. This was the specific reason a Liverpool dock officer in the 1950s worked from what the fire was doing, not from what the paperwork said it should be doing. Foam and dry powder, carried on the appliance from the 1930s onward for exactly this reason, went on to anything that behaved like an oil or chemical fire, regardless of what the manifest claimed was in the drums. Whelan's crew had been trained to treat an unidentified drum fire as a chemical fire until it proved otherwise, because treating it as an ordinary combustible fire, and being wrong, cost more than treating a genuine combustible fire as a chemical one and being overcautious. What did an unlabeled or inconsistently documented chemical shipment mean for how a Liverpool dock officer decided what to put water, or foam, onto, and what happened when the fire behaved differently from what the shed's paperwork had promised? None of what Whelan knew about smoke, bales and drums had come from a training manual alone. The Liverpool Fire Brigade training school had given him the framework, how to read smoke color and density in general terms, how foam and dry powder were meant to behave, how a bale fire was theoretically supposed to be approached. What 11 years at Hatton Garden had given him was the specific application of that framework to Liverpool's own dock sheds, built from attendances the training school had never been present for. The 1951 Wapping reignition. A 1949 drum fire at Coburg Dock that had flared when a crew played water directly onto it. A handful of quieter attendances where nothing had gone wrong, because the smoke had told him early enough what he was dealing with. What his crew needed from him at Toxteth in 1955 was not courage. It was a decision, made in the first 4 minutes, about which of two approaches, the slow, methodical bale-by-bale dismantling that a smouldering cotton fire required, or the foam and powder approach that an unidentified chemical fire required, the grey-white smoke in front of them actually indicated. Get it wrong in either direction, and the crew either spent an hour dismantling bales while a chemical fire spread unchecked somewhere else in the shed, or smothered a straightforward bale fire in foam while the actual smouldering seat kept burning untouched beneath the surface. The 4 minutes between arriving at the appliance and committing the crew to one approach or the other was where 11 years of Hatton Garden attendances did their work. What did Sub-Officer Whelan's crew need him to decide correctly in the first 4 minutes at Toxteth Dock, and what had a training school framework, on its own, never been able to give him? Everything Whelan's generation of Liverpool dock officers knew about mixed cargo risk had one documented extreme case behind it, and it did not involve a composite officer. On the night of 3 May 1941, during the seven-night German air assault on Merseyside known as the May Blitz, incendiaries set fire to the dock sheds around Huskisson Branch Dock No. 2, where the cargo liner SS Malakand lay moored, loaded with roughly 1,000 tons of bombs bound for the Middle East. Flames from the burning sheds spread to the ship. An auxiliary fire service crew under Section Officer Lapin fought the shed fires directly alongside the vessel, in what a subsequent gallantry citation in the London Gazette described as an effort to reach and save the ship before she went up. They could not reach her in time. In the early hours of 4th of May, Malakand exploded, destroying Huskisson Branch Dock No. 2 outright and killing 4 people. The fire that the explosion started took 74 hours to burn out completely. This was the same operational problem Whelan managed at Toxteth 14 years later, cargo whose fire behavior the paperwork did not reliably predict, in dock sheds built to store it, worked by fire crews reading smoke and flame under time pressure, taken to its most extreme and lethal expression. Section Officer Lapin's crew were not wrong to try. They were dealing with a fire that had already had too long a head start in a shed built the same way Toxteth's was, against a cargo that gave no warning before it went from burning to detonating. What did the Huskisson dock fire and the loss of the SS Malakand show about the outer edge of the same cargo fire risk that Whelan managed routinely in 1955? And what did Section Officer Lapin's crew have no way of knowing before the ship exploded? A shed fire at Toxteth, or Wapping, was never only a fire brigade problem. Liverpool's economy in this period ran on the docks in a way few other British cities' economies ran on any single institution. When a transit shed closed for a suspected reignition, the dockers who worked that shed were stood down without pay for as long as the closure lasted. Not because anyone doubted their work, but because a shed under fire watch could not be worked safely, and Liverpool's dock labour in this era was largely paid by the day and the shift, not by a fixed weekly wage. A ship's crew watching their vessel from the quay while a shed fire threatened it were watching their own livelihood as directly as any docker was. Merchants and consignees with cargo inside the shed were watching an insurance claim take shape in real time. Liverpool, in the middle of the 20th century, still carried a substantial share of Britain's transatlantic trade through its Mersey quays. A fire brigade that could contain a dock shed fire quickly, correctly identifying cargo behavior before committing to an approach, was protecting more than the building. It was protecting Liverpool's reliability as a port that shipping lines, insurers, and overseas consignees could trust with cargo that a badly handled fire could turn into a total loss. Whelan's 4 minutes at Toxteth were, in that sense, a decision with consequences well beyond the shed door. What did a Liverpool dock shed closure cost the dockers, the ship's crew, and the merchants who depended on it reopening quickly? And what did Liverpool's standing as a transatlantic port depend on the brigade getting right? What changed the operational conditions Whelan had built his career around was not a single reform, but a slow convergence of several. International dangerous goods documentation for shipping, the kind of standardized cargo declaration that told a fire officer, reliably, what a drum actually contained before it was ever opened by fire, developed through international maritime regulation from the 1960s onward, replacing the inconsistent dockside paperwork Whelan had worked around for most of his career. Liverpool Fire Brigade, like other major port brigades, built up chemical identification resources of its own across the same period, reducing how much a crew had to infer purely from smoke and flame behavior. Dock shed construction standards improved in the post-war rebuilding that followed bomb damage from the Blitz, and from the late 1950s, automatic sprinkler systems began to appear in new transit shed construction, a development that changed what size of fire a crew found when they arrived, rather than changing how the crew fought it once they got there. None of this made the docks safe in any absolute sense. It changed what an experienced dock officer's judgment was being asked to compensate for. A sprinklered shed with a properly declared cargo manifest gave Whelan's successors a fire that had already been partly fought before the Dennis F-12's replacement ever left Hatton Garden. The specific skill of reading grey-white smoke to distinguish a bale fire from a chemical fire, built from 11 years of attendances where that judgment was the only thing standing between the crew and the wrong approach, mattered less in a shed built and documented this way. It had not stopped mattering everywhere. It had stopped mattering here. What did improved cargo documentation, chemical identification resources, and sprinklered shed construction change about the fire a Liverpool dock crew found when they arrived? And what did it mean for the specific judgment that 11 years at Hatton Garden had built in Sub-Officer Whelan? Sub-Officer Frank Whelan's Hatton Garden Dock Division changed considerably in the decade after Toxteth. By the early 1960s, most of the Liverpool transit sheds his generation had worked from memory were either sprinklered, rebuilt to post-Blitz standards, or working from cargo manifests that told a crew, on arrival, roughly what they were dealing with before the first jet was run out. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more dock stations, where a fire officer's judgment was the only thing standing between a shed and a second closure, and more 4-minute decisions learned the wrong way once, that were never written down anywhere, and that kept Toxteth Dock working in 1955. What 11 years at the Hatton Garden Dock Station gave Sub-Officer Whelan was the difference between a bale that looked out and a bale that was out, and that knowledge left the brigade when the transit sheds it was built on were rebuilt around cargo that could no longer burn that way. And if you or your family worked the Liverpool docks, as firemen at Hatton Garden, as dockers, or as harbour board watchmen, put it in the comments. What do you remember about how a shed fire was fought, or what it cost the families depending on that shed staying open? The next video follows the Bristol Docks paint store fires of the 1930s, and what a burning paint store taught Bristol's firefighters about accelerant risk that no cotton warehouse ever could. Liverpool's transit sheds carried standardized cargo declarations as a matter of routine by the mid-1960s. Automatic sprinklers were fitted as standard in new dock construction from the same period. Chemical identification resources at Hatton Garden meant a crew no longer had to infer a drum's contents purely from how it burned. What the redevelopment gave Liverpool's docks: cargo that arrived with a reliable declaration, sheds that fought part of their own fires before the brigade arrived, and chemical hazards identified before a crew committed to an approach. What it removed: the specific judgment built from 11 years of reading grey-white smoke at Toxteth, Wapping and Coburg, the 1951 lesson about a bale that only looked extinguished, and the 4-minute decision that had once been the only thing between a dock shed and a fire that reignited or spread the wrong way. The new sheds did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. They did not need to. That was the point. The knowledge went with the officers who had built it. The old transit sheds went when the rebuilding crews arrived. Nobody had asked either of them to leave anything behind.